Captain Logan once said something which I consider to be one of the best and in fact wisest things that I think any film critic has ever said, because it perfectly sums up what it means to be a film critic and not someone who just posts a rant on the internet saying I like action films and Schindler's List was a boring drama, so it sucks. I think he perfectly summed up the rules that every critic has to abide by, the standards you have to set for yourself and what you cannot do if you want to be really objective and give a valuable analysis that's more than just your own personal opinion. Just listen, I think this is one of the best things any critic has ever said.
That would be like if I hated green beans, which, by the way, I do, but popped open a jar of green beans and reviewed it. And then in my review, I said, these green beans are terrible. I shouldn't have had to eat these. Well, I didn't have to eat them. They exist, and there's nothing I can do about it. So if I'm going to try to objectively review the green beans, I can't hold the fact that they exist and that they are green beans against them. And if I were incapable of putting my green bean prejudice aside, I'm not the guy to review green beans.
I think Matthews should have listened to this more carefully, because I think it perfectly sums up what is wrong with his continuous criticisms of Marvel Studios and their films. He believes it's justified that he criticizes the studio because he believes their movies suck, but the reason I think it's unfair and the reason I think people are right saying that he's biased and he just doesn't like Marvel is because he doesn't like their films and what they are going for on a conceptual level. What do I mean with that? Well, Marvel Studios tries to make their movies like the Marvel comics. They try to make it an ongoing story with every movie being a puzzle of a larger piece. It's kind of like trying to do what some animated series based on comics did, like the Batman animated series, but then do it with multiple franchises and have them coexist on the same level as the comics did, trying to really just make it, well, a very literal adaptation. And Confused Matthew clearly doesn't like that. He wants the films to be standalone. He has a very Puritan, old-fashioned standard about how films need to be standalone and need to be movies first, and need to not only be movies first, but almost entirely just be movies, that they are allowed to have very little tie-ins, that they're not really allowed to be a setup for a next film or to be dependent upon a previous film. And I find this rather strange, because these criticisms were also used to criticize Star Wars and Indiana Jones when they came out, when they started to set up trilogies. A lot of people criticized The Empire Strikes Back for just being a middle chapter. Back then, that went against the Puritan view, the idea of making movies the same way that the old movie serials have been made. And he in fact criticizes Marvel for going back to the cinematic Dark Ages, which, by the way, that's really a dumb and tired expression, but I'm not going to get into why the Dark Ages weren't that dark here. But the point is, he believes that's just going back to the cinematic Dark Ages, but this is again the criticism that was also launched at any movie series back in the 70s and 80s before that became a big thing, because back then that went against the Puritan standard of just continuously making new dramas. Back then the blockbuster was conventional. So to be honest, Confused Matthew kind of sounds like, well, a pretentious film critic who's like, this isn't intellectual enough, this doesn't fit with our standard dramas, this is just a mindless action film. It just sounds very similar to that. A lot of people criticized movie series back in the day, but nowadays it's become the norm. Just as a lot of people nowadays criticize CGI, but back in the 70s and 60s, a reliance on sets instead of location shooting was often considered controversial, and also using digital means to alter sound and music were back then considered controversial. Using digital editing was considered controversial back then, and nowadays we consider it normal, but nowadays we need to keep the CGI to a minimum, just as at one point IMAX was more controversial than it is now. And I think that therefore it's very ironic that Confused Matthew has these rules of, I wanted to see Iron Man, and then I wanted to see a sequel to Iron Man, and because this wasn't just a sequel to Iron Man, I feel robbed, and this goes against what I wanted this movie to be. Okay, but that's kind of like how people back in the 70s just disliked science fiction, how the Oscars only really gave a fair chance of Best Picture to certain kinds of films. I think this is just very similar to that. If you don't like the fact that Marvel Studios wants to really base their films on the comics, if you don't like it being part of a cinematic universe, if you don't like the cinematic universe form of filmmaking, then you just shouldn't watch these films, because that's kind of what they are for. And they satisfy really a lot of people. There are a lot of fans who like to see this. You believe that films steal their money, but it's just what they want. It's like saying that action movies steal money from the audience because they're substanceless. But you like Independence Day because it was good at what it wanted to be. So if you're gonna review Marvel movies, you have to at least judge them on the standards of also being a part of a cinematic universe, not just as normal films. Matthew accepts that art films are different from action films, that they're different from science fiction films, that you've got comedies. Well, these are the cinematic universe films, and I think that inventing your own genre is pretty creative, and he argues that it's going back to an old genre, but again, that is also what Indiana Jones and Alien and everything did, trying to remake the 30s movie serials, but do it with big budget effects and action and actors, and I don't see what's the problem with that. And he tries to substantiate this with a couple of other points, but this is his primary criticism. What if I don't want to see these other films? What if I just want to stick to the franchise I love? I think it's just a commercial. I think it's just sets up other films. I think these are just toy commercials. And again, the criticism, it's just a toy commercial, wasn't just launched at the Star Wars prequels, it was also launched at the original Star Wars films. That's a criticism that was aimed even at comic books themselves. At the core, that's kind of what comic books started off as. That's what the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles original cartoons started off as. And they just try to remake that in big budget modern films. And there are just millions of fans who love that. And I think, and then you will obviously try to argue, well, you had The Dark Knight, that was a standalone film. Yeah, and that was a great drama, and that was really great adult art, but ironically, for a lot of comic book fans, it was Christopher Nolan being too mainstream and not sticking true to the roots of the comics. And you can argue that you only have to stick true to the spirit, but that you need to adapt it to film, and this is usually done. But some people just like a Puritan adaptation, and I don't see why they just can't have what they want. If you're into the Dark Knight kind of thing, then just watch that. But why shouldn't people be allowed to just have a cinematic universe? If this makes a lot of people happy, what is wrong with that? It's kind of like saying, I like science fiction, but I don't like romance movies, but I'm nonetheless going to review romance movies and say they steal people's money, because I don't want to see two people fall in love. I think that love is superficial. I don't really believe in it. I think in the end it's all just lust. So I think these movies are stupid. So I'm just going to watch dozens of romance movies and then I'm going to criticize all of them. That's not being a professional film critic. And that is what Captain Logan perfectly said. If you're going to watch the Marvel Cinematic Universe, you have to at least judge it on its terms. And for example, Captain Logan had quite a couple of critical things to say about Iron Man 2 and 4, and he wasn't even as positive about the Avengers as a lot of other people were. And that's okay, but at least he accepted those films on their terms. He just had critical things to say about the characters and the story, and he liked some more than others, but he didn't base it upon his personal preferences for a standalone film. He did accept them for what they were, and he just looked at how well they did it. And even though I liked a lot of the films a lot more than he did, because I will admit I could be considered a Marvel fanboy, and that except for Iron Man 2 and The Incredible, I consider all Marvel films to at least be basically, well, worthy of at least a 9. So, yeah, I'm biased towards Marvel on a certain level, sure, but I do think I can justify that because I think all of their films just had excellent stories and characters, and I think that a lot of the criticisms on them were unjust, the same way I thought with all 3 of the Star Wars prequels, and I could perfectly explain that, and I think you're perfectly entitled to explaining why you don't like these films, but you cannot criticize them just for what they are on a conceptual level. You're right that it's wrong for people to say that 4 is good just because it ties into a cinematic universe, but it's just as incorrect as to say that it sucks just because it ties into a cinematic universe. Because what I find ironic is that Confused Matthew, in his original The Avengers review, indicated he hadn't fully seen Thor or Captain America, but he'd already written both off as being suckish films. Well, that indicates extreme bias, not even having seen 2 films in their entireties and saying that both of them suck. And he has refused to review both because he just says they're commercials, but he doesn't go beyond it. He says they have terrible characters and Thor isn't developed, but I would like him to explain it a little bit more. I think that Thor clearly learned to be more humble, and that being a hero means the importance of sacrifice, that he learned the importance of patience and of listening to his father. I would say that that's to a strong degree what the film is about, and one of the writers even explained all of this when he was discussing with Screen Junkies, and they actually gave him a fair chance to make his case. And on a similar level, I would say that Captain America, as he has pointed out, was also strongly an underdog story, and Captain Logan discusses what he thinks works about this and what he thinks didn't, but he just says it sucks and I find the origin story boring. He has even admitted that he finds Iron Man just on a conceptual level the most interesting character, and what do you know, he thinks Iron Man 3 was one of the best out of all of the films. And not only that, but he thinks The Dark Knight is the best superhero film, but the only comics he's ever read are Batman comics. So again, that indicates just a little bit of a bias. It's just more his thing. if you like the Batman comics but you've never read Marvel comics, and he admitted he isn't a superhero guy, and he especially doesn't like all of them being stuffed in, then yeah, that's just gonna mean that you have extremely high standards. It's like being a science fiction critic, and then even though you don't like science fiction, but then trying to justify that you constantly criticize science fiction films just for being heavily reliant on technobabble and futuristic stuff, because there are a couple of science fiction films you do like. Okay, well, I generally don't like vegetables, even though I'm 20 years old. Yeah, I'm gonna die from diabetes soon. But there are a couple of forms of vegetables I like, but I don't think that entitles me to being a vegetable critic, to be honest. If I am still gonna criticize 90% of them for saying I think vegetables taste badly. Which once again brings us back to Captain Logan's analogy. He really just likes the superhero genre, and he just accepts what they tried to do with them most of the time. I think one of his lesser reviews was X-Men The Last Stand, because he mainly just criticized it for its decision to dramatically kill characters off, and it just left him feeling hollow, and he just didn't like the, well, more down and serious ending. But I thought that he failed to explain how it wasn't balanced, and how it was okay for X2 to have comedic moments, but not X-Men The Last Stand, and I thought he was kind of nitpicky, but the point is he usually does try to really explain stuff in detail, instead of just saying, where's the story in all of this? There is no story. The characters don't talk about anything. The characters suck. You can say all of that and you can repeat it over and over and over, but I could just review all of three of the Dark Knight films right now. I'll just start off with Batman Begins. I don't really think that this film is about a story at all. I think that it's just about a couple of conspiracies, and they just repeat the word fear over and over and over again. I don't think there's any real substantial theme at all. I think it's just repeating the word fear, and that it's just very pretentious. I'm not going to explain further why, but that's just the way I feel. I feel The Dark Knight was just to showcase Heath Ledger's performance, and that it was way too humorous. I think the humor didn't fit a couple of the comedic moments that were there. I still think that was too much. I'm not going to explain how or how it sucked. It just sucked, and I thought the actors sucked. End of story. I think the Batman films suck. Oh, by the way, I never really liked the comics to begin with. In fact, I hated the Batman comics, but still though, I did like Batman Forever, so I do think I'm a fair objective critic, because I like Batman Forever for how colorful it was. But what if I didn't want to see a dark film? I think dark films suck. These films are too depressing. Also, I think they just in general have bad stories, but it's mainly that. This is Confused Matthew's reviews of every Marvel film he didn't like, summed up in a nutshell. Just like whenever you want to see one of his reviews, this just sums it up perfectly. He doesn't like them at a conceptual level, and he just goes on entire tirades about them. And I think that this just shows that he is biased. If you don't want to be biased against the Marvel Studios, you have to at least accept what they're going for at a conceptual level. If you don't, now, yeah, you just don't like Marvel because you just don't like what they do. It's like me saying, oh no, I don't just dislike that bakery store. I like them when they don't sell pie, but they sell bonbons. However, most of the time they sell pie, and I dislike pie, so they suck. Okay, I did like that one pie out of 100, but all of the other ones I thought sucked. That one had lemon in it, and I like lemons. It's kind of on that level. And I think that this is the biggest problem with his criticisms of the studios, but it also goes a little bit further, because he very selectively cites evidence against them, and he also often tries to put words in people's mouths, and even tries to justify speculation. I think he's a lot like John Cornwell in that regard. Yeah, that was a backhanded criticism once again. But in all seriousness, for example, he claims that one online source indicated that Jon Favreau was unhappy with how Iron Man 2 turned out, but then he does try to completely weaken his defense of Edgar Wright by calling him Ass Kisser of the Year, by claiming that they also fucked with his movie, which he actually bases on second-hand information, which is kind of like me trying to weaken someone's testimony in court against the claim that somebody beat up his girlfriend, because he had previously been dating that guy's former girlfriend, and some guy claimed that he said that guy had also been beating his former girlfriends. So he beat your girlfriend, and now he beats his next girlfriend, so grow some fucking balls and stand up to him. You know, it's kind of like that. It's kind of weird to try to use Jon Favreau in favor of your speculation that Edgar Wright got screwed over, when Jon Favreau himself says something to the contrary. So, in fact, when he tries to indicate that both Jon Favreau and Edgar Wright were screwed over, both of it is purely speculative. He actually tries to justify speculation with that whole political joke, but it basically comes down to, if you can't come up with a better form of speculation, it means you automatically have to accept mine. Which is basically like if somebody shoots the president and then somebody remarks, I think it was the previous president, Bush, and then I say, well, I'm not sure about it. Alright, then who do you think it was? I don't know. Alright, then it was Bush. It's kind of on that level. Trying to use speculation against the studio is, well, once again rather biased, and it's especially biased as obviously he likes Edgar Wright a lot, but none of his films were really that big major blockbusters, so I don't even really think he had that big of a status, and he wasn't that bankable. Obviously Edgar Wright is a talented filmmaker, but nonetheless Confused Matthew thinks he's one of the greatest people alive, and that he is a very integral man, but that's his opinion, and he nonetheless tries to treat that as fact, and he treats Edgar Wright as victim until proven otherwise, and he treats Marvel Studios as guilty until proven innocent. That's clearly his attitude towards them, and he even pretends that they would just be like, fuck your Iron Man 2 movie, but they just treated this as a part of a greater series. And and as he mentions himself, there's often a give and take between studios and movie directors, but in the case of a lot of other studios, that also went a lot farther than some people would like to pretend. For example, some films like Blade Runner and even Aliens had heavy studio interference in the editing, so much to the point that Sigourney Weaver originally didn't even want to return for Alien 3. In fact, the original Alien had great studio interference. So I mean, Kingdom of Heaven had some great studio interference. There are so many director's cuts out there. There are so many directors who are dissatisfied with the way that their movies edited and with script mandates. These happen all the time. I mean, these have happened to Quentin Tarantino with how eventually Natural Born Killers was changed. Directors changed writers their scripts. Producers changed the scripts of writers. Joe Silver was very controlling even over people like Richard Donner and John McTiernan. Films have been edited all the time. People like to mention the bad examples, like, Batman and Robin and Superman 3, and yeah, obviously those exist, but a lot of popular films still had great studio interference, ranging from films like Seven to the original Spider-Man, and even films like Spider-Man 2. And also, Walt Disney Studios interfered in so many films, including even the films of talented Pixar. Even Pixar Studios itself interfered with the making of Ratatouille. Studio interference is as old as time itself. Robert Zemeckis has encountered it. Steven Spielberg has encountered it. I mean, really, I'm sorry, but trying to cite studio interference even happened strongly with the original Tim Burton's Batman. It has happened so many times. Trying to specifically use this against Marvel Studios, and the creators of films have often left production for the sequels. This even, happened with the Lethal Weapon series, where Shane Black left because Richard Donner changed his script on Lethal Weapon 2. So I think it's just kind of ridiculous to try to cite that a couple of people left and to automatically assume that just because they're talented, Marvel Studios has to be in the wrong. I mean, Shane Black was very happy with what he got to do in Iron Man 3. Kenneth Branagh still got to do a lot of great stuff on 4. They often hire talented filmmakers. They hired Joe Johnston for the original Captain America. They had Joss Whedon work on the first Avengers, the second Avengers, and on Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. along with Jet Whedon. So they've involved really a lot of talented filmmakers. Robert Downey Jr. was satisfied with his involvement on all of the films. And I wouldn't exactly say that Mark Ruffalo is untalented. Neither is, I think, Scarlett Johansson, for example. And yeah, I know he didn't like Hawkeye's character and he didn't like Black Widow's character, but that's on how they were written, right? He acknowledged that Scarlett Johansson did a great job performance-wise, to the extent that she played a character. And would you really say, because you hated The Incredible Hulk, that Edward Norton played a great character? He thought the character development in the film sucked, right? He thought he had nothing to do. His performance was good, but the writing wasn't. So maybe Edward Norton not being hired again for the Avengers was screwing over one actor, but considering all of the actors that returned for multiple films, I mean, it happens so often that actors don't return for the sequels or aren't asked to return. The fact that it really only happened with this one actor on so many films, I think shows that they're pretty good job with them. I mean, Chris Evans returned, Chris Hemsworth returned, and I know you don't like Nick Fury, but Samuel Jackson is Samuel Jackson, and he was willing to appear in countless of the films. He was willing to appear twice on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., which I will always appreciate him for. So, and Confused Matthew even complained that Tim Burton had too much control over Batman Returns. Sometimes films have been criticized for the filmmakers having too much creative control and themselves being too dictatorial. And often there is one primary force in filmmaking. It can be a collaboration a lot of the time, but a lot of the time in the end there is a decisive force and a lot of compromises are made, and this is especially the case with big budget franchises. But in the case of Marvel Studios, they had nearly gone bankrupt in the past, and they were really depending upon these films to be successful, which were based on their own comics. So it's like Shakespeare having been nearly bankrupt, and then movies being made based on his work. So obviously he's going to interfere quite a bit, and obviously if he makes over 10 films, there are going to be some people who eventually disagree, especially if they work together on multiple films. Eventually there are going to be disagreements. And I mean, Edward Norton refused to advertise The Incredible Hulk for whatever reason. There's still debate over that, and he was heavily involved with trying to have it edited the way he wanted to, after he was already allowed to edit the script. So it's not like he didn't get a lot of creative control, but in spite of that, when he couldn't get even more, and when he also just disagreed with the producers, he didn't support the advertisement for the film. That is going to lead to trouble. And he has often had a lot of creative control, but the problem is that it seems as though a lot of these famous filmmakers who are very talented are just used to so much control over their own work that they can't work within a certain framework. But it doesn't mean that Marvel is unreasonable per se, but maybe just that Marvel is a more controlling studio and that they are just cannot work properly with such studios. That just has happened. James Cameron has disagreed with film studios. There have been so many people who eventually had fallings out. I think it's kind of ridiculous to try to use in total 4 examples against Marvel Studios. And also think it's kind of weird that Confused Matthew tried to use Argumentum and Populum when it came to James Gunn, when Guardians of the Galaxy was immensely popular, and he thinks that's unjustified, but maybe his films were unjustly criticized. And no, I haven't seen the Scooby-Doo films, but the point is you can't use Argumentum and Populum on one hand when trying to criticize a popular studio and their popular films on the other. I think that that's just incredibly biased. And yeah, he was the writer and director for hire, and they to a certain degree just work better with people who work for hire, because in the end Kevin Feige is also a very hands-on producer, because it all just ties together. I mean, Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is known for being incredibly innovative and just how strongly television and movies became interwoven there. And I loved it for that, because I just loved this concept. I actually started off watching Iron Man and Iron Man 2 without having seen the other films, and I was a little confused. But when I learned about the Avengers, I just watched all of the films there and credit scenes. And if I wasn't into that sort of thing, or I didn't have the time, which for a while I didn't, which is why I actually only watched the Avengers later on, but if I had never been into that sort of thing, I would have just not watched all of these films, but I accept it on its terms. And I think that Confused Matthew should be willing to do that also. And I think that he should at least wait with criticizing a film until he has seen it in its entirety. He even had to backtrack a little bit on his review on the Avengers because of how extremely biased it was. I mean, he even just made fun of the one-liners in that, saying that it was like somebody saying, well, gee, you're an old meat popsicle. What does that even mean? You know, it kind of reminds me of Confused Matthew's Attack of the Clones review with his, I love you, oh, me too. It's kind of like you are just mocking and ranting at that point. I don't even really see your criticism anymore. He says the story just sucked, that the villain just sucked. Eventually he tried to justify his criticisms on Loki, and he also tried to defend the Mandarin, but it was once again based on, I'm okay with this being different from the comics, and I like this just working in a movie kind of way. And personally, I don't really mind that either, and I like it when they sometimes do change things up, but it's okay to just have films for the fans. I don't see, it reminds me of the Star Trek The Next Generation films, which First Contact was also incredibly popular with audiences, but because they weren't just made for audiences, because they stuck to their roots, Confused Matthew criticized them. Once again, at a conceptual level, for just being very close to the television series. He always just wants movies to be very separate and stand alone, but that's his standard. And when a lot of people are happy with it and get what they want, you can't say that their wallets, are being stolen when they actually asked for these sort of films. I like it when there are end credit scenes. I like seeing a puzzle being built, and I go to see that, so I don't feel screwed over. It's just as when I go to see an action film, I'm happy to see an action film. I just like what they do. So yeah, you just don't like Marvel because you just don't like Marvel-style movies. I think that's the problem. And I think that that's just a very clear bias. And I think that Confused Matthew in the end has to get over that, or he does have to stop reviewing their films. And I also think that that's the problem with his theorizing on the whole Ant-Man affair. So I think that this indicates that Confused Matthew isn't nearly as objective as he would like to pretend to be. And also Mickey Rourke obviously is a great actor, and I think he's also a great person, but if you look at how he was swearing on television, clearly he is kind of rude and outspoken, and in the end he's maybe gonna have some disagreements also. But films get edited all the time. Actors feel as though their performances have been ruined all the time. I mean, even the original Godfather had immense editing. The original Patton had great studio interference. And I mean, these are some of the most famous Coppola films, but Coppola was willing to, in the end, accept a lot of studio demands, because that was just part of the business. I mean, Brian De Palma's faced that. Martin Scorsese faced this making Taxi Driver, and not just a little, both in getting the chance to make it in the script and the editing. studio interference has happened with so many great films and so many famous films. It has even happened with Stanley Kubrick's Spartacus. Why does Marvel Studios get singled out for a couple of occasions that this happened, especially when this didn't really happen with the original Iron Man, when this cannot be said to have happened with Iron Man 3, and he eventually later on tries to pretend that he did like these films, but when he tries to criticize Marvel, he says that they only made two legitimately good films and that they were flukes or anomalies, but when he tries to deflect the criticism that he would be biased, suddenly he counts Iron Man 4, The Dark World, and Agent Carter amongst the things that he actually did like. So it's really 4 films and a TV show. And yeah, granted, that's other statement that had been made prior to Agent Carter, but so he suddenly counts the films that he early on called just mindless action as films that he likes, when he's saying, I'm not biased, but he's saying in the end they were just mindless action, when he's saying how much Marvel sucks. So he changes the terms when it suits him, and I think that shows even more bias on his part, and I think all of that is a problem. And I also think it's ironic that he criticizes Guardians of the Galaxy for ironically trying too much with its story and being too dark and too dramatic, when he constantly criticizes Marvel for playing it safe and not taking risks, but then he criticizes a movie that's incredibly complex and dark for not just being mindless fun. I also think, well, what do you want? That's really something that I'm starting to wonder. The Confused Matthew is constantly changing standards, and even with the Winter Soldier, he indicated he didn't like the genre it was based on. It reminds me of how he criticized the Star Wars prequels and the political aspects in it when he says he knows little to nothing about politics, and he knows little to nothing about war, but he sometimes still criticizes war movies. I just think that that's incredibly hypocritical. A lot of the time, Confused Matthew's film reviews are just rants because he doesn't really know the kind of genre that he's reviewing, yet he tries to review it anyways, just because he doesn't like it. And at that point, he isn't really a reviewer anymore, he's just a guy ranting on the internet. And we have enough of those already. So, in the end, I think that if Confused Matthew really wants to, well, deflect the criticism, you just don't like Marvel, accept their terms. And also think that Confused Matthew should stop changing his terms whenever he tries to deflect criticism. I think that that's just getting incredibly unfair. And I think he should just watch their films in their entireties if he wants to fairly criticize them. And I also think it's ridiculous he criticized the Faces concept, and once again that's just part of how the cinematic universe works, and it's kind of based on how you have seasons in TV shows, and I have no problem with there eventually being in a Captain America 16 and a 415, and if I did, I just wouldn't go see these films. And a lot of the films he criticized even before they came out, just based on either how the previous film was, like Iron Man 2, or based on the fact that someone like Edgar Wright got fired, which once again shows that he's extremely biased. He's even admitted to being biased towards Baz Luhrmann, still not having reviewed Australia. So yeah, that I think is the ultimate problem. And also that Confused Matthew doesn't really listen to Marvel's side of the story, and even when the people who would supposedly be victims of Marvel deflect these criticisms, he says that they are both wrong. He says, no, they did screw you over. And I think that that's the ultimate problem. The only person who really agreed with Confused Matthew and his criticisms on Marvel was Mickey Rourke, who doesn't even know what DC is, so it's not like he really knows how comic book movies work. So yeah, Confused Matthew, I do think you're biased, and I think you should try to look at it more from the other side. I think you should play devil's advocate a little bit more often. The end.